I'm so sorry. I can't believe my son would do something like that. My mother-in-law came to visit suddenly while my husband was away on a business trip. As I was surprised by her unexpected visit, she started apologizing to me. When I showed her the photos of the scene of my husband's affair, "There are more than one," she looked shocked. I figured out what was going on, and I stood up for it with my mother-in-law. My name is Isabella, and I'm 30 years old. I've been married to my husband, James, who is 3 years older than me, for 3 years. I met him 5 years ago. It all began when he approached me while I was drinking at my favorite bar with my friends when I was 25 years old. It's not like I had never been approached by guys when I was with my friends or shopping alone. Usually, I would just ignore those who approached me with a playful demeanor, but, "I'm sorry. This is a pickup, but would you like to have a drink with us?" When James approached me with a bright red face, I couldn't help but burst into laughter. James, his friend, my friend, and I started drinking together, and James and I found ourselves sharing the same sense of humor and hit it off. Our relationship developed from friendship to a romantic relationship after James asked me out formally. We got married after dating for 2 years. I found out that James goes on business trips frequently while we were dating, and he would be away from the city at least once a month. The duration of his trips varied. Sometimes he would return in 2 days, while on other occasions, he would be gone for a week or more when there was trouble at work. Of course, I felt lonely at times in the beginning, but I've gotten somewhat used to it these days. If we have children, the loneliness I feel when he is away for my birthdays or Christmas may be different. However, it's been almost 3 years since we got married, and we still haven't been blessed with children. I get a little depressed whenever I get the texts or postcards which announce their pregnancy from friends who got married around the same time as me. However, children are a blessing. Don't worry so much. I'm sure a baby will come to us in due time. James would always reassure me with comforting words. I had another strong source of support besides James, and that was his mother, Emma, my mother-in-law. I had come to this city when I started university, got a job here, and got married. Since my parents, who lived in a place where I have to take an airplane to get to, still worked full-time, we were all too busy and I couldn't easily make a trip back home. Therefore, even though I wanted to discuss our childlessness with them, I couldn't bring myself to do it over texts or phone calls as I feared I would unnecessarily worry them. On the other hand, James' family lived nearby, just a short walk from our current apartment. His parents were both very gentle and kind-hearted people, who treated me exceptionally well. I had always dreamed of getting along with his wife when James got married. My mother-in-law in particular treated me as if I were her own daughter. Whenever James and I had minor disagreements or conflicts, she would lend her ear and give me advice, and thanks to her, we had reconciled more than a few times. I often wondered if the issues between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law I heard about in the world were even real. My mother-in-law and I went out and had meals together when I had days off from work. When James was away on a business trip, I would have dinner with my in-laws as they invited me, and sometimes even stayed overnight. I even thought that maybe I, a daughter-in-law, spent more time having fun with my in-laws than their son. I was spending my days being supported by my in-laws like that, but James was still as busy as ever. Recently, he has been traveling around more than ever before due to a new client. With James's excessive busyness and frequent absences, our mutual friend even teased us from time to time. "Isn't he working a bit too much? LOL. Is it really just work? Nothing suspicious?" She would say these things, but James would always bring back local souvenirs from his business trips, for my in-laws and me, so I didn't think he was lying. But still, it is true that something has been bugging me more and more about James' behavior lately. Actually, a woman I had never met in person suddenly started following me on Instagram recently. At first, I thought she might be randomly selecting people and following, hoping they would follow her back so that she can boost her follower count. But when I checked her Instagram, she didn't seem to be seeking self-validation or promoting anything. However, when I paid closer attention to her pictures, I noticed that many of her photos had cryptic tags. The man in the photos, often captured from behind or showing only parts of their bodies, somewhat resembled James. Furthermore, the dates of her posts seemed to align with James's business trips when he was away from home. Could this be a declaration of war? With that thought in mind, I decided to investigate further, just to be sure. I started by scrolling back through her posts on Instagram, and found that the suggestive photos had started appearing about 6 months ago. I also discovered a Twitter account with the same name and profile picture as her Instagram. According to the Twitter account, she appeared to be in her early 20s, and I shouldn't say like this, but she seemed to be a somewhat thoughtless person. After I wondered what to do for a little while, I concluded that it was best to get to the bottom of this, and I decided to hire a professional. After a while, I received a report from the detective. It turned out that my suspicions were correct. James had indeed been having an affair with the woman on Instagram. I'm going on another business trip tomorrow, so look forward to some souvenirs. Even though I had prepared myself to some extent, when I saw the evidence of his infidelity in front of my eyes, I was still shocked. If we were just dating, breaking up would be a relatively straightforward solution. However, since we are married, there are many troublesome legal procedures and financial issues to deal with, so we can't really end the relationship right then and there. Handing him divorce papers wouldn't solve everything either. Besides, divorcing James would mean severing ties with my in-laws as well. A week had passed since I received the detective's report, but I still couldn't decide on what to do. On the other hand, James, unaware of my feelings, went on a business trip as usual. He might be meeting his affair partner again, using a business trip as an excuse. When I thought that, the tears welled up because I was angry and also frustrated. As I sat on the couch in the living room, and I was idly looking at the report, the intercom rang unexpectedly. Who could it be? Thinking that, I looked at the monitor and saw my mother-in-law standing there. While it was true that our houses were within walking distance, I couldn't recall a time when she had come to our house unannounced this late at night, which was past 9 o'clock. I quickly brought her inside, but her usual cheerful demeanor was absent, and she had an unusually solemn expression with a pale complexion. Seeing my mother-in-law like this for the first time, I sensed that something serious was afoot. I hurriedly seated her on the couch and asked what had happened. My mother-in-law exclaimed, "I'm so sorry. It seems like James is behaving like the lowest of the low." When I heard her words, I was surprised that my mother-in-law also knew about James's infidelity. However, James would never voluntarily confess his affair to his parents, so I wondered how they found out. Are you talking about James's affair? I actually found it out recently as well. When I confessed, my mother-in-law was clearly shocked that I was already aware of it. I then explained to my mother-in-law about the Instagram where I had discovered James's infidelity. I showed her the photos of James's affair partner on my phone. As she gazed at the screen of the phone I was showing to her, she suddenly looked up at me and said, "No! No, this isn't the girl I'm talking about. Unbelievable. Just how many people is he involved with?" she exclaimed. She went on to explain in a shaky voice with a flushed face that she had become suspicious about 2 weeks ago, when she went out to dinner with a friend. The restaurant, with its pleasant atmosphere, is often used for business meetings during lunch hours, so she initially assumed that the woman whom James was with was a work-related acquaintance. She discreetly observed James and the woman, since her table was hidden from James' table as it was behind a pillar. and she began to notice their strange behavior. My mother-in-law became suspicious as she saw James and the woman exchange lingering glances and casually hold hands while eating across from each other. She told her friend what was happening, and when they secretly followed James and the woman, to their surprise, James and the woman went into a hotel district in broad daylight. I was in shock and disbelief. My mother-in-law continued. But my friend managed to take some photos at the spur of the moment. The woman in the photos she showed me indeed appeared to be a different person from the one on Instagram. We could only see her back in the picture, but she was wearing a suit and had black hair, and she looked neat and tidy. In contrast, the woman on Instagram had blonde hair and dressed in a flashy fashion. I was indeed stunned as I was looking at the photos of the two women and comparing them with each other. My mother-in-law told me that she had been agonizing over whether to tell me about James's affair or not for the last 6 months. I wanted to confront James about it first, but I haven't been able to reach him at all, she said, but that may not be too surprising. Until now, I have only communicated with him by texting, not by calling, as I did not want to disturb him while he was on a business trip. However, from what my mother-in-law told me, I think that James is trying to avoid answering any calls except for those from the company during his business trip. And my consideration not to disturb him, as I did not want to disturb his work while he was on a business trip, may have resulted in encouraging James to have an affair. However, from what my mother-in-law told me, I felt stupid rather than feeling frustrated or annoyed. I think that James is trying to avoid answering any calls except for those from the company during his business trip. My mother-in-law seemed anxious and worried about me, but I felt oddly calm. Perhaps, deep down, I had already prepared myself for this situation, after receiving what felt like a declaration of war through Instagram from that woman. When I told my mother-in-law, she squeezed my hand. I understand. Let's do what makes you happy, Isabella, she said. 2 days after my mother-in-law's unexpected visit, James returned from his business trip as planned. However, upon entering the living room and seeing both his parents there, he became visibly flustered. Huh? Why are you guys here? Did something happen? He must have sensed something when both of his parents were frowning and not smiling at all. My father-in-law, remaining seated, stared at James. Enough questions, just sit down. When he said that, James sat down in the chair across from his parents, looking frightened. At that moment, I placed a printed copy of the photos that my mother-in-law's friend had taken at the scene of James's affair on the table in front of him. James was instantly fixated on the photos, freezing in place. This man, he's you, isn't he? So, who is this woman? Can you explain? I asked him coldly with my arms crossed. Then, James said, This isn't what it looks like. I just had lunch with a coworker, and she drank too much wine, so I had to take care of her. James started making excuses. However, it's odd to drink wine with a coworker at lunch in the first place, and there is no reason at all to go to a hotel even if she gets drunk. While I was pointing it out in my head, I pretended to have accepted his explanation for the time being, seemingly believing that he was off the hook. Come on, you all gathered here for such a misunderstanding? You and my parents must have a lot of free time, James said with a smug face. When I saw his face like that, I became irritated. Oh, really? But there are other women, right? If you think you haven't been caught, you're in for a surprise, I retorted coldly. I might reconsider my stance if you tell me the truth, I added. At first, James pretended to be innocent, asking, What do you mean by if you think you haven't been caught and other women? However, as my in-laws and I continued to stare at him sternly with a serious face, he began to break into a cold sweat. Eventually, I'm sorry, he mumbled. From there, James confessed everything. He admitted that the woman in the photos was indeed a coworker, and they had been involved in an inappropriate relationship for some time. He also revealed that he had a similar relationship with a temp worker in a different department after a night of drinking. But as my mother-in-law and I listened to him in silence, a big question came to our minds. That's because the woman I had confronted James about earlier was of course the woman who had declared war on Instagram. Judging from her profile, she must be a girl he met on a business trip that he often goes on, and she couldn't possibly work at the same company as him. Moreover, that is clearly stated in the report from a professional, so there should be no mistake. So, when I asked James, "Then who is this person? If you say that she works at the same company as you, it doesn't make sense, does it?" When I showed him the printout of the Instagram profile, he exclaimed and turned pale. He started panicking, and he was trying to come up with an excuse. Then, my father-in-law seemed to have reached his limit and yelled, "What are you saying? I can't even hear you. Speak up if you're a man." When James heard this, his body jerked and stiffened, but he finally started to explain everything nervously. According to him, there were a total of 4 women with whom he had an affair, including those with only a physical relationship. It seems that he has a deep relationship with 2 of them, including the woman on Instagram whom he met on a business trip. Moreover, he has been involved with the woman on Instagram for 6 months and with the other woman for a year. Hearing this, I became hopeless. I was shocked not only by that he had been involved with multiple women, but also that these relationships had been going on for a while. Yet, James tried to get forgiveness somehow. "I'm so sorry. I am remorseful and will never do something like this again." He apologized desperately. However, what nonsense! You think you'll be forgiven after all that? Never! My father-in-law was enraged. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law sat there, sobbing uncontrollably. It was truly a nightmarish scene. Once my mother-in-law had somewhat composed herself, I asked James for the reasons behind his affairs. I thought that perhaps I might have been at fault in some way. But he replied, "I have no complaints about you. It's just that I got carried away by the situation." He apologized again, begging for forgiveness. However, there was no way that I could forgive him. I don't need a husband who betrays his wife after he gets married just because he got carried away, I told him. James said, "I'm really sorry. Please forgive me. The only person I love is you." And he clung. But who would believe such words now? I turned to my parents-in-law, who was silent, apologized to them first, and told them that I'm going to divorce him. James became even more pale when he heard my words. "Wait a minute! I'll cut ties with my affair partners!" He yelled, but we all ignored him completely. My mother-in-law sighed and reluctantly accepted my decision, even though she was truly disappointed. Upon hearing her words, I turned to face James. "How can I just go on like nothing happened when you've insulted me to that extent? I'm going to demand compensation from you and your partners," I said firmly. "But, compensation? What does that have to do with those girls?" James shouted. However, at least the woman on Instagram, maybe not the other women, knew that James was married, and she tried to pick a fight with me, his wife. Since she engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a married man, I need her to reflect on her actions. The same goes for the other women if they knew that he was married. Desperate, James turned to his parents for help, tears streaming down his face. However, my mother-in-law said, "We are fully on Isabella's side. We don't even consider you our son anymore, and you'll have to deal with the consequences." James collapsed to his knees upon hearing this. In the following days, with the help of the lawyer my in-laws recommended, I started the divorce procedure. According to the lawyer, The woman on Instagram was indeed aware of my existence as James' wife, and she seemed to have tried to pick a fight with me just so that she can one-up me. Moreover, she had believed it when James said let's get married, so she was quite shocked. As for the two co-workers at James' company, it is true that they only slept with him a couple of times, but at this point, it doesn't matter how many times, they are completely guilty. I decided to claim compensation from the woman on Instagram and the two co-workers after I consulted with the lawyer. As for the other woman, I just asked the lawyer to advise her to demand compensation from James, if she didn't know that he was married and she was deceived. Meanwhile, the fact of his affair came to light when the lawyer contacted James' company. He was fired for causing a fuss by having an affair on a business trip, and also for having inappropriate relations with two women in the company. The two co-workers faced pay cuts, but one of them resigned right away. The other temporary employee left the company when her contract expired. Furthermore, James is in a dire situation now, as the woman, who didn't know that James was married, told him that she is going to sue him for marriage fraud. Although he texted his parents and me desperate messages asking for help, we ignored the texts after reading them and eventually blocked him, so we don't know what happened to him after that. As for me, the divorce was finalized successfully and I received a fair amount of compensation thanks to my lawyer. I found a new job and I'm enjoying peaceful time with my in-laws on the weekends just like before.